Part 1 of Life in California, excerpted from Roughing It by Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. Life in California, excerpted from Roughing It by Mark Twain. Part 1, Chapter 56. We rumbled over the plains and valleys, climbed the Sierras to the clouds, and looked down upon summer-clad California. And I will remark here, in passing, that all scenery in California requires distance to give it its highest charm. The mountains are imposing in their sublimity and their majesty of form and altitude from any point of view. But one must have distance to soften their ruggedness and enrich their tintings. A Californian forest is best at a little distance, for there is a sad poverty of variety in species, the trees being chiefly of one monotonous family, redwood, pine, spruce, fir, and so, at a near view, there is a wearisome sameness of attitude in their rigid arms, stretched downward and outward in one continued and reiterated appeal to all men to "Shh, don't say a word, you might disturb somebody." Close at hand, too, there is a reliefless and relentless smell of pitch and turpentine. There is a ceaseless melancholy in their sighing and complaining foliage. One walks over a soundless carpet of beaten yellow bark and dead spines of the foliage till he feels like a wandering spirit bereft of a footfall. He tires of the endless tufts of needles and yearns for substantial, shapely leaves. He looks for moss and grass to loll upon, and finds none, for where there is no bark there is naked clay and dirt, enemies to pensive musing and clean apparel. Often a grassy plain in California is what it should be, but often, too, it is best contemplated at a distance, because although its grass blades are tall, they stand up vindictively straight and self-sufficient, and are unsociably wide apart, with uncomely spots of barren sand between. One of the queerest things I know of is to hear tourists from the States go into ecstasies over the loveliness of ever-blooming California. And they always do go into that sort of ecstasies, but perhaps they would modify them if they knew how old Californians, with the memory full upon them of the dust-covered and questionable summer greens of Californian verdure, stand astonished and filled with worshipping admiration in the presence of the lavish richness, the brilliant green, the infinite freshness, the spendthrift variety of form and species and foliage that make an eastern landscape a vision of paradise itself. The idea of a man falling into raptures over grave and somber California, when that man has seen New England's meadow expanses, and her maples, oaks, and cathedral-windowed elms decked in summer attire, or the opaline splendors of autumn descending upon her forests, comes very near being funny. Would be, in fact, but that it is so pathetic. No land with an unvarying climate can be very beautiful. The tropics are not, for all the sentiment that is wasted on them. They seem beautiful at first, but sameness impairs the charm by and by. Change is the handmaiden nature requires to do her miracles with. The land that has 4 well-defined seasons cannot lack beauty, or pall with monotony. Each season brings a world of enjoyment and interest in the watching of its unfolding, its gradual harmonious development, its culminating graces. And just as one begins to tire of it, it passes away, and a radical change comes, with new witcheries and new glories in its train. And I think that to one in sympathy with nature, each season in its turn seems the loveliest. San Francisco, a truly fascinating city to live in, is stately and handsome at a fair distance, but close at hand one notes that the architecture is mostly old-fashioned. Many streets are made up of decaying, smoke-grimed wooden houses, and the barren sandhills toward the outskirts obtrude themselves too prominently. Even the kindly climate is sometimes pleasanter when read about than personally experienced, for a lovely cloudless sky wears out its welcome by and by, and then when the longed-for rain does come, it stays. Even the playful earthquake is better contemplated at a distance. However, there are varying opinions about that. The climate of San Francisco is mild and singularly equable. The thermometer stands at about 70 degrees the year round. It hardly changes at all. You sleep under one or two light blankets summer and winter, and never use a mosquito bar. Nobody ever wears summer clothing. You wear black broadcloth, if you have it, in August and January, just the same. It is no colder and no warmer in the one month than the other. You do not use overcoats, and you do not use fans. It is as pleasant a climate as could well be contrived, take it all around, and is doubtless the most unvarying in the whole world. The wind blows there a good deal in the summer months, but then you can go over to Oakland if you choose, 3 or 4 miles away. It does not blow there. It has only snowed twice in San Francisco in 19 years, and then it only remained on the ground long enough to astonish the children and set them to wondering what the feathery stuff was. During 8 months of the year, straight along, the skies are bright and cloudless, and never a drop of rain falls. But when the other 4 months come along, you will need to go and steal an umbrella, because you will require it. Not just one day, but 120 days in hardly varying succession. When you want to go visiting, or attend church, or the theater, you never look up at the clouds to see whether it is likely to rain or not. You look at the almanac. If it is winter, it will rain, and if it is summer, it won't rain, and you cannot help it. You never need a lightning rod, because it never thunders, and it never lightens. And after you have listened for 6 or 8 weeks, every night, to the dismal monotony of those quiet rains, you will wish in your heart the thunder would leap and crash and roar along those drowsy skies once and make everything alive. You will wish the prisoned lightnings would cleave the dull firmament asunder and light it with a blinding glare for one little instant. You would give anything to hear the old familiar thunder again and see the lightning strike somebody. And along in the summer, when you have suffered about 4 months of lustrous, pitiless sunshine, you are ready to go down on your knees and plead for rain, hail, snow, thunder and lightning, anything to break the monotony. You will take an earthquake if you cannot do any better, and the chances are that you'll get it, too. San Francisco is built on sand hills, but they are prolific sand hills. They yield a generous vegetation. All the rare flowers which people in the States rear with such patient care in parlor flower pots and greenhouses flourish luxuriantly in the open air there all the year round. Calla lilies, all sorts of geraniums, passion flowers, moss roses. I do not know the names of a 10th part of them. I only know that while New Yorkers are burdened with banks and drifts of snow, Californians are burdened with banks and drifts of flowers, if they only keep their hands off and let them grow. And I have heard that they have also that rarest and most curious of all flowers, the beautiful Espiritu Santo, as the Spaniards call it, or flower of the Holy Spirit, though I thought it grew only in Central America, down on the Isthmus. In its cup is the daintiest little facsimile of a dove, as pure as snow. The Spaniards have a superstitious reverence for it. The blossom has been conveyed to the States submerged in ether, and the bulb has been taken thither also, but every attempt to make it bloom after it arrived has failed. I have elsewhere spoken of the endless winter of Mono, California, and but this moment of the eternal spring of San Francisco. Now, if we travel 100 miles in a straight line, we come to the eternal summer of Sacramento. One never sees summer clothing or mosquitoes in San Francisco, but they can be found in Sacramento. Not always and unvaryingly, but about 143 months out of 12 years, perhaps. Flowers bloom there always, the reader can easily believe. People suffer and sweat and swear, morning, noon, and night, and wear out their staunchest energies fanning themselves. It gets hot there, but if you go down to Fort Yuma, you will find it hotter. Fort Yuma is probably the hottest place on earth. The thermometer stays at 120 in the shade there all the time, except when it varies and goes higher. It is a U.S. military post, and its occupants get so used to the terrific heat that they suffer without it. There is a tradition, attributed to John Phoenix. It has been purloined by 50 different scribblers who were too poor to invent a fancy, but not ashamed to steal one, M.T., that a very, very wicked soldier died there once, and of course went straight to the hottest corner of perdition, and the next day he telegraphed back for his blankets. There is no doubt about the truth of this statement. There can be no doubt about it. I have seen the place where that soldier used to board. In Sacramento, it is fiery summer always, and you can gather roses, and eat strawberries and ice cream, and wear white linen clothes, and pant and perspire at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, and then take the cars, and at noon put on your furs and your skates and go skimming over frozen Donner Lake, 7,000 feet above the valley, among snowbanks 15 feet deep, and in the shadow of grand mountain peaks that lift their frosty crags 10,000 feet above the level of the sea. There is a transition for you. Where will you find another like it in the Western Hemisphere? And some of us have swept around snow-walled curves of the Pacific Railroad in that vicinity, 6,000 feet above the sea, and looked down, as the birds do, upon the deathless summer of the Sacramento Valley, with its fruitful fields, its feathery foliage, its silver streams, all slumbering in the mellow haze of its enchanted atmosphere, and all infinitely softened and spiritualized by distance. A dreamy, exquisite glimpse of fairyland, made all the more charming and striking that it was caught through a forbidden gateway of ice and snow and savage crags and precipices. End of Part 1. Part 2 of Life in California, excerpted from Roughing It by Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 2, Chapter 57. It was in this Sacramento Valley, just referred to, that a deal of the most lucrative of the early gold mining was done, and you may still see, in places, its grassy slopes and levels torn and guttered and disfigured by the avaricious spoilers of 15 and 20 years ago. You may see such disfigurements far and wide over California, and in some such places, where only meadows and forests are visible, not a living creature, not a house, no stick or stone or remnant of a ruin, and not a sound, not even a whisper to disturb the Sabbath stillness. You will find it hard to believe that there stood at one time a fiercely flourishing little city of 2,000 or 3,000 souls, with its newspaper, fire company, brass band, volunteer militia, bank, hotels, busy 4th of July processions and speeches, gambling hells crammed with tobacco smoke, profanity, and rough-bearded men of all nations and colors, with tables heaped with gold dust sufficient for the revenues of a German principality, streets crowded and rife with business, town lots worth $400 a front foot, labor, laughter, music, dancing, swearing, fighting, shooting, stabbing, a bloody inquest and a man for breakfast every morning, and everything that delights and adorns existence, all the appointments and appurtenances of a thriving and prosperous and promising young city, and now nothing is left of it but a lifeless, homeless solitude. The men are gone, the houses have vanished, even the name of the place is forgotten. In no other land, in modern times, have towns so absolutely died and disappeared as in the old mining regions of California. It was a driving, vigorous, restless population in those days. It was a curious population. It was the only population of the kind that the world has ever seen gathered together, and it is not likely that the world will ever see its like again. For observe, it was an assemblage of 200,000 young men, not simpering, dainty, kid-gloved weaklings, but stalwart, muscular, dauntless young braves, brimful of push and energy, and royally endowed with every attribute that goes to make up a peerless and magnificent manhood, the very pick and choice of the world's glorious ones. No women, no children, no gray and stooping veterans, none but erect, bright-eyed, quick-moving, strong-handed young giants, the strangest population, the finest population, the most gallant host that ever trooped down the startled solitudes of an unpeopled land. And where are they now? Scattered to the ends of the earth, or prematurely aged and decrepit, or shot or stabbed in street affrays, or dead of disappointed hopes and broken hearts, all gone, or nearly all, victims devoted upon the altar of the golden calf, the noblest holocaust that ever wafted its sacrificial incense heavenward. It is pitiful to think upon. It was a splendid population, for all the slow, sleepy, sluggish-brained sloths stayed at home. You never find that sort of people among pioneers. You cannot build pioneers out of that sort of material. It was that population that gave to California a name for getting up astounding enterprises and rushing them through with a magnificent dash and daring and a recklessness of cost or consequence which she bears unto this day. And when she projects a new surprise, the grave world smiles as usual and says, "Well, that is California all over." But they were rough in those times. They fairly reveled in gold, whiskey, fights, and fandangos, and were unspeakably happy. The honest miner raked from $100 to $1,000 out of his claim a day, and what with the gambling dens and the other entertainments, he hadn't a cent the next morning, if he had any sort of luck. They cooked their own bacon and beans, sewed on their own buttons, washed their own shirts, blue woolen ones, and if a man wanted a fight on his hands without any annoying delay, all he had to do was to appear in public in a white shirt or a stovepipe hat, and he would be accommodated. For those people hated aristocrats. They had a particular and malignant animosity toward what they called a biled shirt. It was a wild, free, disorderly, grotesque society. Men, only swarming hosts of stalwart men, nothing juvenile, nothing feminine, visible anywhere. In those days, miners would flock in crowds to catch a glimpse of that rare and blessed spectacle, a woman. Old inhabitants tell how, in a certain camp, the news went abroad early in the morning that a woman was come. They had seen a calico dress hanging out of a wagon down at the camping ground, sign of immigrants from over the Great Plains. Everybody went down there, and a shout went up when an actual bona fide dress was discovered, fluttering in the wind. The male immigrant was visible. The miners said, "Fetch her out." He said, "It is my wife, gentlemen. She is sick. We have been robbed of money, provisions, everything by the Indians. We want to rest." "Fetch her out. We've got to see her." "But, gentlemen, the poor thing, she—" "Fetch her out." He fetched her out, and they swung their hats and sent up 3 rousing cheers and a tiger. And they crowded around and gazed at her and touched her dress and listened to her voice with the look of men who listened to a memory rather than a present reality, and then they collected $2,500 in gold and gave it to the man and swung their hats again and gave 3 more cheers and went home satisfied. Once I dined in San Francisco with the family of a pioneer and talked with his daughter, a young lady whose first experience in San Francisco was an adventure, though she herself did not remember it, as she was only 2 or 3 years old at the time. Her father said that after landing from the ship, they were walking up the street, a servant leading the party, with the little girl in her arms. And presently a huge miner, bearded, belted, spurred, and bristling with deadly weapons, just down from a long campaign in the mountains, evidently barred the way, stopped the servant, and stood gazing, with a face all alive with gratification and astonishment. And then he said reverently, "Well, if it ain't a child!" And then he snatched a little leather sack out of his pocket and said to the servant, "There's $150 in dust there, and I'll give it to you to let me kiss the child." That anecdote is true. But see how things change. Sitting at that dinner table, listening to that anecdote, if I had offered double the money for the privilege of kissing the same child, I would have been refused. 17 added years have far more than doubled the price. And while upon this subject, I will remark that once in Star City, in the Humboldt Mountains, I took my place in a sort of long post office single file of miners to patiently await my chance to peep through a crack in the cabin and see a sight of the splendid new sensation, a genuine live woman. And at the end of half an hour my turn came, and I put my eye to the crack, and there she was, with one arm akimbo, and tossing flapjacks in a frying pan with the other. And she was 165. Being in calmer mood now, I voluntarily knock off 100 from that, MT, years old, and hadn't a tooth in her head. End of Part 2. Part 3 of Life in California, excerpted from Roughing It by Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Chapter 58. For a few months I enjoyed what to me was an entirely new phase of existence, a butterfly idleness. Nothing to do, nobody to be responsible to, and untroubled with financial uneasiness. I fell in love with the most cordial and sociable city in the Union. After the sagebrush and alkali deserts of Washoe, San Francisco was paradise to me. I lived at the best hotel, exhibited my clothes in the most conspicuous places, infested the opera, and learned to seem enraptured with music which oftener afflicted my ignorant ear than enchanted it, if I had had the vulgar honesty to confess it. However, I suppose I was not greatly worse than the most of my countrymen in that. I had longed to be a butterfly, and I was one at last. I attended private parties in sumptuous evening dress, simpered and aired my graces like a born beau, and polked and schottished with a step peculiar to myself and the kangaroo. In a word, I kept the due state of a man worth $100,000, prospectively, and likely to reach absolute affluence when that silver mine sale should be ultimately achieved in the East. I spent money with a free hand, and meantime I watched the stock sales with an interested eye and looked to see what might happen in Nevada. Something very important happened. The property holders of Nevada voted against the state constitution, but the folks who had nothing to lose were in the majority and carried the measure over their heads. But after all, it did not immediately look like a disaster, though unquestionably it was one. I hesitated, calculated the chances, and then concluded not to sell. Stocks were on rising. Speculation went mad. Bankers, merchants, lawyers, doctors, mechanics, laborers, even the very washerwomen and servant girls, were putting up their earnings on silver stocks, and every sun that rose in the morning went down on paupers enriched and rich men beggared. What a gambling carnival it was! Gould and Curry soared to $6,300 a foot. And then, all of a sudden, out went the bottom, and everything and everybody went to ruin and destruction. The wreck was complete. The bubble scarcely left a microscopic moisture behind it. I was an early beggar, and a thorough one. My hoarded stocks were not worth the paper they were printed on. I threw them all away. I, the cheerful idiot that had been squandering money like water, and thought myself beyond the reach of misfortune, had not now as much as $50 when I gathered together my various debts and paid them. I removed from the hotel to a very private boarding-house. I took a reporter's berth and went to work. I was not entirely broken in spirit, for I was building confidently on the sale of the silver mine in the East. But I could not hear from Dan. My letters miscarried or were not answered. One day I did not feel vigorous and remained away from the office. The next day I went down toward noon as usual, and found a note on my desk which had been there 24 hours. It was signed Marshall, the Virginia reporter, and contained a request that I should call at the hotel and see him and a friend or two that night, as they would sail for the East in the morning. A postscript added that their errand was a big mining speculation. I was hardly ever so sick in my life. I abused myself for leaving Virginia and entrusting to another man a matter I ought to have attended to myself. I abused myself for remaining away from the office on the one day of all the year that I should have been there. And thus berating myself, I trotted a mile to the steamer wharf and arrived just in time to be too late. The ship was in the stream and under way. I comforted myself with the thought that maybe the speculation would amount to nothing, poor comfort at best, and then went back to my slavery, resolved to put up with my $35 a week and forget all about it. A month afterward I enjoyed my first earthquake. It was one which was long called the Great Earthquake, and is doubtless so distinguished till this day. It was just after noon on a bright October day. I was coming down 3rd Street. The only objects in motion anywhere in sight in that thickly built and populous quarter were a man in a buggy behind me, and a streetcar wending slowly up the cross street. Otherwise all was solitude and a Sabbath stillness. As I turned the corner around a frame house, there was a great rattle and jar, and it occurred to me that here was an item, no doubt a fight in that house. Before I could turn and seek the door, there came a really terrific shock. The ground seemed to roll under me in waves, interrupted by a violent jogging up and down, and there was a heavy grinding noise as of brick houses rubbing together. I fell up against the frame house and hurt my elbow. I knew what it was now, and from mere reportorial instinct, nothing else, took out my watch and noted the time of day. At that moment a third and still severer shock came, and as I reeled about on the pavement trying to keep my footing, I saw a sight. The entire front of a tall 4-story brick building in 3rd Street sprung outward like a door and fell sprawling across the street, raising a dust like a great volume of smoke. And here came the buggy. Overboard went the man, and in less time than I can tell it, the vehicle was distributed in small fragments along 300 yards of street. One could have fancied that somebody had fired a charge of chair rounds and rags down the thoroughfare. The streetcar had stopped, the horses were rearing and plunging, the passengers were pouring out at both ends, and one fat man had crashed halfway through a glass window on one side of the car, got wedged fast, and was squirming and screaming like an impaled madman. Every door of every house, as far as the eye could reach, was vomiting a stream of human beings, and almost before one could execute a wink and begin another, there was a massed multitude of people stretching in endless procession down every street my position commanded. Never was solemn solitude turned into teeming life quicker. Of the wonders wrought by the great earthquake, these were all that came under my eye, but the tricks it did elsewhere, and far and wide over the town, made toothsome gossip for 9 days. The destruction of property was trifling. The injury to it was widespread and somewhat serious. The curiosities of the earthquake were simply endless. Gentlemen and ladies who were sick, or were taking a siesta, or had dissipated till a late hour and were making up lost sleep, thronged into the public streets in all sorts of queer apparel, and some without any at all. One woman, who had been washing a naked child, ran down the street holding it by the ankles as if it were a dressed turkey. Prominent citizens, who were supposed to keep the Sabbath strictly, rushed out of saloons in their shirt sleeves with billiard cues in their hands. Dozens of men with necks swathed in napkins rushed from barber shops, lathered to the eyes, or with one cheek clean shaved and the other still bearing a hairy stubble. Horses broke from stables, and a frightened dog rushed up a short attic ladder and out onto a roof, and when his scare was over, had not the nerve to go down again the same way he had gone up. A prominent editor flew downstairs in the principal hotel with nothing on but one brief undergarment, met a chambermaid, and exclaimed, "Oh, what shall I do? Where shall I go?" She responded with naive serenity, "If you have no choice, you might try a clothing store." A certain foreign consul's lady was the acknowledged leader of fashion, and every time she appeared in anything new or extraordinary, the ladies in the vicinity made a raid on their husbands' purses and arrayed themselves similarly. One man, who had suffered considerably and growled accordingly, was standing at the window when the shocks came, and the next instant the consul's wife, just out of the bath, fled by with no other apology for clothing than a bath towel. The sufferer rose superior to the terrors of the earthquake and said to his wife, "Now that is something like! Get out your towel, my dear." The plastering that fell from ceilings in San Francisco that day would have covered several acres of ground. For some days afterward, groups of eyeing and pointing men stood about many a building, looking at long zigzag cracks that extended from the eaves to the ground. 4 feet of the tops of 3 chimneys on one house were broken square off and turned round in such a way as to completely stop the draft. A crack 100 feet long gaped open 6 inches wide in the middle of one street, and then shut together again with such force as to ridge up the meeting earth like a slender grave. A lady sitting in her rocking and quaking parlor saw the wall part at the ceiling, open and shut twice like a mouth, and then drop the end of a brick on the floor like a tooth. She was a woman easily disgusted with foolishness, and she arose and went out of there. One lady, who was coming downstairs, was astonished to see a bronze Hercules lean forward on its pedestal as if to strike her with its club. They both reached the bottom of the flight at the same time, the woman insensible from the fright. Her child, born some little time afterward, was club-footed. However, on second thought, if the reader sees any coincidence in this, he must do it at his own risk. The first shock brought down 2 or 3 huge organ pipes in one of the churches. The minister, with uplifted hands, was just closing the services. He glanced up, hesitated, and said, "However, we will omit the benediction." And the next instant there was a vacancy in the atmosphere where he had stood. After the first shock, an Oakland minister said, "Keep your seats, there is no better place to die than this," and added after the third, "But outside is good enough." He then skipped out at the back door. Such another destruction of mantel ornaments and toilet bottles as the earthquake created, San Francisco never saw before. There was hardly a girl or a matron in the city but suffered losses of this kind. Suspended pictures were thrown down, but oftener still, by a curious freak of the earthquake's humor, they were whirled completely round with their faces to the wall. There was great difference of opinion at first as to the course or direction the earthquake traveled, but water that splashed out of various tanks and buckets settled that. Thousands of people were made so seasick by the rolling and pitching of floors and streets that they were weak and bedridden for hours, and some few for even days afterward. Hardly an individual escaped nausea entirely. The queer earthquake episodes that formed the staple of San Francisco gossip for the next week would fill a much larger book than this, and so I will diverge from the subject. By and by, in the due course of things, I picked up a copy of the Enterprise one day, and fell under this cruel blow. Nevada Mines in New York. G. N. Marshall, Sheba Hurs, and Amos H. Rose, who left San Francisco last July for New York City with ores from mines in Pinewood District, Humboldt County, and on the Reese River Range, have disposed of a mine containing 6,000 feet and called the Pine Mountains Consolidated for the sum of $3 million. The stamps on the deed, which is now on its way to Humboldt County from New York for record, amounted to $3,000, which is said to be the largest amount of stamps ever placed on one document. A working capital of $1 million has been paid into the Treasury, and machinery has already been purchased for a large quartz mill, which will be put up as soon as possible. The stock in this company is all full paid and entirely unaccessible. The ores of the mines in this district somewhat resemble those of the Sheba mine in Humboldt. Sheba Hurst, the discoverer of the mines, with his friends corralled all the best leads and all the land and timber they desired before making public their whereabouts. Ores from there, assayed in this city, showed them to be exceedingly rich in silver and gold, silver predominating. There is an abundance of wood and water in the district. We are glad to know that New York capital has been enlisted in the development of the mines of this region. Having seen the ores and assays, we are satisfied that the mines of the district are very valuable, anything but wildcat. Once more, native imbecility had carried the day, and I had lost $1 million. It was the blind lead over again. Let us not dwell on this miserable matter. If I were inventing these things, I could be wonderfully humorous over them, but they are too true to be talked of with hearty levity, even at this distant day. True, and yet not exactly as given in the above figures, possibly. I saw Marshall months afterwards, and although he had plenty of money, he did not claim to have captured an entire $1 million. In fact, I gathered that he had not then received $50,000. Beyond that figure, his fortune appeared to consist of uncertain, vast expectations rather than prodigious certainties. However, when the above item appeared in print, I put full faith in it and incontinently wilted and went to seed under it. Suffice it that I so lost heart and so yielded myself up to repinings and sighings and foolish regrets that I neglected my duties and became about worthless as a reporter for a brisk newspaper. And at last one of the proprietors took me aside, with a charity I still remember with considerable respect, and gave me an opportunity to resign my berth and so save myself the disgrace of a dismissal. End of Part 3. Part 4 of Life in California, excerpted from Roughing It by Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 4, Chapter 59. For a time I wrote literary screeds for the Golden Era. C.H. Webb had established a very excellent literary weekly called The Californian, but high merit was no guarantee of success. It languished, and he sold out to 3 printers, and Bret Harte became editor at $20 a week, and I was employed to contribute an article a week at $12. But the journal still languished, and the printers sold out to Captain Ogden, a rich man and a pleasant gentleman, who chose to amuse himself with such an expensive luxury without much caring about the cost of it. When he grew tired of the novelty, he resold to the printers. The paper presently died a peaceful death, and I was out of work again. I would not mention these things but for the fact that they so aptly illustrate the ups and downs that characterize life on the Pacific coast. A man could hardly stumble into such a variety of queer vicissitudes in any other country. For 2 months my sole occupation was avoiding acquaintances, for during that time I did not earn a penny, or buy an article of any kind, or pay my board. I became a very adept at slinking. I slunk from back street to back street. I slunk away from approaching faces that looked familiar. I slunk to my meals, ate them humbly and with a mute apology for every mouthful I robbed my generous landlady of, and at midnight, after wanderings that were but slinkings away from cheerfulness and light, I slunk to my bed. I felt meaner and lowlier and more despicable than the worms. During all this time I had but one piece of money, a silver 10-cent piece, and I held to it and would not spend it on any account, lest the consciousness coming strong upon me that I was entirely penniless might suggest suicide. I had pawned everything but the clothes I had on, so I clung to my dime desperately till it was smooth with handling. However, I am forgetting. I did have one other occupation besides that of slinking. It was the entertaining of a collector, and being entertained by him, who had in his hands the Virginia banker's bill for $46 which I had loaned my schoolmate, the prodigal. This man used to call regularly once a week and dun me, and sometimes oftener. He did it from sheer force of habit, for he knew he could get nothing. He would get out his bill, calculate the interest for me at 5% a month, and show me clearly that there was no attempt at fraud in it and no mistakes, and then plead and argue and dun with all his might for any sum, any little trifle, even $1, even $half, on account. Then his duty was accomplished and his conscience free. He immediately dropped the subject there always, got out a couple of cigars and divided, put his feet in the window, and then we would have a long, luxurious talk about everything and everybody, and he would furnish me a world of curious dunning adventures out of the ample store in his memory. By and by he would clap his hat on his head, shake hands, and say briskly, "Well, business is business, can't stay with you always," and was off in a second. The idea of pining for a dun! And yet I used to long for him to come, and would get as uneasy as any mother if the day went by without his visit when I was expecting him. But he never collected that bill at last, nor any part of it. I lived to pay it to the banker myself. Misery loves company. Now and then at night, in out-of-the-way, dimly lighted places, I found myself happening on another child of misfortune. He looked so seedy and forlorn, so homeless and friendless and forsaken, that I yearned toward him as a brother. I wanted to claim kinship with him and go about and enjoy our wretchedness together. The drawing toward each other must have been mutual. At any rate, we got to falling together oftener, though still seemingly by accident. And although we did not speak or evince any recognition, I think the dull anxiety passed out of both of us when we saw each other, and then for several hours we would idle along contentedly, wide apart, and glancing furtively in at home lights and fireside gatherings out of the night shadows, and very much enjoying our dumb companionship. Finally we spoke, and were inseparable after that. For our woes were identical, almost. He had been a reporter, too, and lost his berth, and this was his experience, as nearly as I can recollect it. After losing his berth, he had gone down, 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 with never a halt, from a boarding-house on Russian Hill to a boarding-house in Kearney Street, from thence to DuPont, from thence to a low sailor den, and from thence to lodgings in goods boxes and empty hogsheads near the wharves. Then, for a while, he had gained a meagre living by sewing up bursted sacks of grain on the piers. When that failed, he had found food here and there as chance threw it in his way. He had ceased to show his face in daylight now, for a reporter knows everybody, rich and poor, high and low, and cannot well avoid familiar faces in the broad light of day. This mendicant Blücher, I call him that for convenience, was a splendid creature. He was full of hope, pluck, and philosophy. He was well read and a man of cultivated taste. He had a bright wit and was a master of satire. His kindliness and his generous spirit made him royal in my eyes, and changed his curbstone seat to a throne and his damaged hat to a crown. He had an adventure once which sticks fast in my memory as the most pleasantly grotesque that ever touched my sympathies. He had been without a penny for 2 months. He had shirked about obscure streets, among friendly dim lights, till the thing had become second nature to him. But at last he was driven abroad in daylight. The cause was sufficient. He had not tasted food for 48 hours, and he could not endure the misery of his hunger in idle hiding. He came along a back street, glowering at the loaves and bake-shop windows, and feeling that he could trade his life away for a morsel to eat. The sight of the bread doubled his hunger, but it was good to look at, anyhow, and imagine what one might do if one only had it. Presently, in the middle of the street, he saw a shining spot, looked again, did not and could not believe his eyes, turning away to try them, then looked again. It was a verity, no vain, hunger-inspired delusions. It was a silver dime. He snatched it, gloated over it, doubted it, bit it, found it genuine, choked his heart down, and smothered an alleluia. Then he looked around, saw that nobody was looking at him, threw the dime down where it was before, walked away a few steps, and approached again, pretending he did not know it was there, so that he could re-enjoy the luxury of finding it. He walked around it, viewing it from different points, then sauntered about with his hands in his pockets, looking up at the signs, and now and then glancing at it, and feeling the old thrill again. Finally he took it up and went away, fondling it in his pocket. He idled through unfrequented streets, stopping in doorways and corners to take it out and look at it. By and by he went home to his lodgings, an empty queensware hogshead, and employed himself till night trying to make up his mind what to buy with it. But it was hard to do. To get the most for it was the idea. He knew that at the Miners' Restaurant he could get a plate of beans and a piece of bread for 10 cents, or a fish ball and some few trifles, but they gave no bread with 1 fish ball there. At French Pete's he could get a veal cutlet, plain, and some radishes and bread for 10 cents, or a cup of coffee, a pint at least, and a slice of bread. But the slice was not thick enough by the 1/8 of an inch, and sometimes they were still more criminal than that in the cutting of it. At 7 o'clock his hunger was wolfish, and still his mind was not made up. He turned out and went up Merchant Street, still ciphering, and chewing a bit of stick, as is the way of starving men. He passed before the lights of Martin's restaurant, the most aristocratic in the city, and stopped. It was a place where he had often dined in better days, and Martin knew him well. Standing aside just out of the range of the light, He worshipped the quails and steaks in the show window, and imagined that maybe the fairy times were not gone yet, and some prince in disguise would come along presently and tell him to go in there and take whatever he wanted. He chewed his stick with a hungry interest as he warmed to his subject. Just at this juncture he was conscious of someone at his side, sure enough, and then a finger touched his arm. He looked up over his shoulder and saw an apparition, a very allegory of hunger. It was a man 6 feet high, gaunt, unshaven, hung with rags, with a haggard face and sunken cheeks, and eyes that pleaded piteously. This phantom said, "Come with me, please." He locked his arm in Blucher's and walked up the street to where the passengers were few and the light not strong, and then, facing about, put out his hands in a beseeching way and said, "Friend, stranger, look at me. Life is easy to you. You go about, placid and content, as I did once in my day. You have been in there and eaten your sumptuous supper, and picked your teeth and hummed your tune, and thought your pleasant thoughts, and said to yourself, 'It is a good world.' But you've never suffered. You don't know what trouble is. You don't know what misery is, nor hunger. Look at me. Stranger, have pity on a poor, friendless, homeless dog. As God is my judge, I have not tasted food for 48 hours. Look in my eyes and see if I lie. Give me the least trifle in the world to keep me from starving. Anything. 25 cents. Do it, stranger, do it, please. It will be nothing to you, but life to me. Do it, and I will go down on my knees and lick the dust before you. I will kiss your footprints. I will worship the very ground you walk on. Only 25 cents. I am famishing, perishing, starving by inches. For God's sake, don't desert me." Blucher was bewildered, and touched, too, stirred to the depths. He reflected, thought again, then an idea struck him, and he said, "Come with me." He took the outcast's arm and walked him down to Martin's restaurant, seated him at a marble table, placed the bill of fare before him, and said, "Order what you want, friend. Charge it to me, Mr. Martin." "All right, Mr. Blucher," said Martin. Then Blucher stepped back and leaned against the counter and watched the man stow away cargo after cargo of buckwheat cakes at 75 cents a plate, cup after cup of coffee, and porterhouse steaks worth $2 apiece. And when $6.50 worth of destruction had been accomplished and the stranger's hunger appeased, Blucher went down to French Pete's, bought a veal cutlet plain, a slice of bread, and 3 radishes with his dime, and set to and feasted like a king. Take the episode all around, it was as odd as any that can be culled from the myriad curiosities of California life, perhaps. End of Part 4. Part 5 of Life in California, excerpted from Roughing It by Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 5, Chapter 60. By and by, an old friend of mine, a miner, came down from one of the decayed mining camps of Tuolumne, California, and I went back with him. We lived in a small cabin on a verdant hillside, and there were not 5 other cabins in view over the wide expanse of hill and forest. Yet a flourishing city of 2,000 or 3,000 population had occupied this grassy, dead solitude during the flush times of 12 or 15 years before, and where our cabin stood had once been the heart of the teeming hive, the center of the city. When the mines gave out, the town fell into decay, and in a few years wholly disappeared. Streets, dwellings, shops, everything, and left no sign. The grassy slopes were as green and smooth and desolate of life as if they had never been disturbed. The mere handful of miners still remaining had seen the town springing up, spread, grow, and flourish in its pride, and they had seen it sicken and die and pass away like a dream. With it their hopes had died and their zest of life. They had long ago resigned themselves to their exile and ceased to correspond with their distant friends or turn longing eyes toward their early homes. They had accepted banishment, forgotten the world, and been forgotten of the world. They were far from telegraphs and railroads, and they stood, as it were, in a living grave, dead to the events that stirred the globe's great populations, dead to the common interests of men, isolated and outcast from brotherhood with their kind. It was the most singular and almost the most touching and melancholy exile that fancy can imagine. One of my associates in this locality, for 2 or 3 months, was a man who had had a university education. But now, for 18 years, he had decayed there by inches, a bearded, rough-clad, clay-stained miner, and at times, among his sighings and soliloquizings, he unconsciously interjected vaguely remembered Latin and Greek sentences. Dead and musty tongues, meet vehicles for the thoughts of one whose dreams were all of the past, whose life was a failure. A tired man, burdened with the present and indifferent to the future. A man without ties, hopes, interests, waiting for rest and the end. In that one little corner of California is found a species of mining which is seldom or never mentioned in print. It is called pocket mining, and I am not aware that any of it is done outside of that little corner. The gold is not evenly distributed through the surface dirt, as in ordinary placer mines, but is collected in little spots, and they are very wide apart and exceedingly hard to find. But when you do find one, you reap a rich and sudden harvest. There are not now more than 20 pocket miners in that entire little region. I think I know every one of them personally. I have known one of them to hunt patiently about the hillsides every day for 8 months without finding gold enough to make a snuff box, his grocery bill running up relentlessly all the time, and then find a pocket and take out of it $2,000 in 2 dips of his shovel. I have known him to take out $3,000 in 2 hours and go and pay up every cent of his indebtedness, then enter on a dazzling spree that finished the last of his treasure before the night was done. And the next day he bought his groceries on credit as usual, and shouldered his pan and shovel and went off to the hills, hunting pockets again, happy and content. This is the most fascinating of all the different kinds of mining, and furnishes a very handsome percentage of victims to the lunatic asylum. Pocket hunting is an ingenious process. You take a spadeful of earth from the hillside and put it in a large tin pan and dissolve and wash it gradually away till nothing is left but a teaspoonful of fine sediment. Whatever gold was in that earth has remained, because, being the heaviest, it has sought the bottom. Among the sediment you will find half a dozen yellow particles no larger than pinheads. You are delighted. You move off to one side and wash another pan. If you find gold again, you move to one side further and wash a third pan. If you find no gold this time, you are delighted again, because you know you are on the right scent. You lay an imaginary plan, shaped like a fan, with its handle up the hill, for just where the end of the handle is, you argue that the rich deposit lies hidden, whose vagrant grains of gold have escaped and been washed down the hill, spreading farther and farther apart as they wandered. And so you proceed up the hill, washing the earth and narrowing your lines every time the absence of gold in the pan shows you that you are outside the spread of the fan. And at last, 20 yards up the hill, your lines have converged to a point. A single foot from that point, you cannot find any gold. Your breath comes short and quick. You are feverish with the excitement. The dinner bell may ring its clapper off. You pay no attention. Friends may die, weddings transpire, houses burn down. They are nothing to you. You sweat and dig and delve with a frantic interest, and all at once you strike it. Up comes a spadeful of earth and quartz that is all lovely, with soiled lumps and leaves and sprays of gold. Sometimes that one spadeful is all, $500. Sometimes the nest contains $10,000, and it takes you 3 or 4 days to get it all out. The pocket miners tell of one nest that yielded $60,000, and 2 men exhausted it in 2 weeks and then sold the ground for $10,000 to a party who never got $300 out of it afterward. The hogs are good pocket hunters. All the summer they root around the bushes and turn up 1,000 little piles of dirt, and then the miners long for the rains beat upon these little piles and wash them down and expose the gold, possibly right over a pocket. 2 pockets were found in this way by the same man in one day. One had $5,000 in it, and the other $8,000. That man could appreciate it, for he hadn't had a cent for over a year. In Tuolumne lived 2 miners who used to go to the neighboring village in the afternoon and return every night with household supplies. Part of the distance they traversed a trail and nearly always sat down to rest on a great boulder that lay beside the path. In the course of 13 years they had worn that boulder tolerably smooth, sitting on it. By and by 2 vagrant Mexicans came along and occupied the seat. They began to amuse themselves by chipping off flakes from the boulder with a sledgehammer. They examined one of these flakes and found it rich with gold. That boulder paid them $800 afterward. But the aggravating circumstance was that these greasers knew that there must be more gold where that boulder came from, and so they went panning up the hill and found what was probably the richest pocket that region has yet produced. It took 3 months to exhaust it, and it yielded $120,000. The 2 American miners who used to sit on the boulder are poor yet, and they take turnabout in getting up early in the morning to curse those Mexicans. And when it comes down to pure ornamental cursing, the native American is gifted above the sons of men. I have dwelt at some length upon this matter of pocket mining because it is a subject that is seldom referred to in print, and therefore I judged that it would have for the reader that interest which naturally attaches to novelty. End of Part 5. Part 6 of Life in California, excerpted from Roughing It by Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 6, Chapter 61. One of my comrades there, another of these victims of 18 years of unrequited toil and blighted hopes, was one of the gentlest spirits that ever bore its patient cross in a weary exile. Grave and simple Dick Baker, pocket miner of Deadhouse Gulch. He was 46, gray as a rat, earnest, thoughtful, slenderly educated, slouchily dressed, and clay-soiled, but his heart was finer metal than any gold his shovel ever brought to light, than any, indeed, that ever was mined or minted. Whenever he was out of luck and a little downhearted, he would fall to mourning over the loss of a wonderful cat he used to own, for where women and children are not, men of kindly impulses take up with pets, for they must love something. And he always spoke of the strange sagacity of that cat with the air of a man who believed in his secret heart that there was something human about it, maybe even supernatural. I heard him talking about this animal once. He said, "Gentlemen, I used to have a cat here, by the name of Tom Quartz, which you'd took an interest in, I reckon. Most anybody would. I had him here 8 year, and he was the remarkablest cat I ever see. He was a large gray one of the Tom specie, and he had more hard natural sense than any man in his camp, and a power of dignity. He wouldn't let the governor of Californy be familiar with him. He never catched a rat in his life, 'peared to be above it. He never cared for nothing but mining. He knowed more about mining, that cat did, than any man I ever see. You couldn't tell him nothing about placer diggin's, and as for pocket mining, why, he was just born for it. He would dig out after me and Jim when we went over the hills prospecting, and he would trot along behind us for as much as 5 mile, if we went so fur. And he had the best judgment about mining ground. Why, you never see anything like it. When we went to work, he'd scatter a glance around, and if he didn't think much of the indications, he would give a look, as much as to say, "Well, I'll have to get you to excuse me." And without another word, he'd heist his nose into the air and shove for home. But if the ground suited him, he would lay low and keep dark till the first pan was washed, and then he would sidle up and take a look, and if there was about 6 or 7 grains of gold, he was satisfied. He didn't want no better prospect than that. And then he would lay down on our coats and snore like a steamboat till we'd struck the pocket, and then get up and superintend. He was nearly lightning on superintending. Well, by and by up comes this year quartz excitement. Everybody was into it. Everybody was picking and blasting instead of shoveling dirt on the hillside. Everybody was putting down a shaft instead of scraping the surface. Nothing would do Jim, but we must tackle the ledges too, and so we did. We commenced putting down a shaft, and Tom Quartz, he began to wonder what in the dickens it was all about. He hadn't ever seen any mining like that before, and he was all upset, as you may say. He couldn't come to a right understanding of it, no way. It was too many for him. He was down on it, too, you bet you. He was down on it powerful, and always appeared to consider it the cussedest foolishness out. But that cat, you know, was always agin newfangled arrangements. Somehow he never could abide 'em. You know how it is with old habits. But by and by Tom Quartz began to get sort of reconciled a bit, though he never could altogether understand that eternal sinking of a shaft and never panning out anything. At last he got to coming down in the shaft hisself to try to cipher it out. And when he get the blues and feel kind of scruffy and aggravated and disgusted, knowing as he did that the bills was running up all the time and we weren't making a cent, he would curl up on a gunny sack in the corner and go to sleep. Well, one day when the shaft was down about 8 foot, the rock got so hard that we had to put in a blast, the first blasting we'd ever done since Tom Quartz was born. And then we lit the fuse and clum out and got off about 50 yards and forgot and left Tom Quartz sound asleep on the gunny sack. In about a minute we seen a puff of smoke burst up out of the hole, and then everything let go with an awful crash, and about 4 million ton of rocks and dirt and smoke and splinters shot up about 1.5 miles in the air, and by George, right in the dead center of it was old Tom Quartz a-going end over end, and a-snorting and a-sneezing and a-clawing and a-reaching for things like all possessed. But it warn't no use, you know, it warn't no use, and that was the last we see of him for about 2.5 minutes. And then all of a sudden it begun to rain rocks and rubbish, and directly he come down kerwhop about 10 foot off from where we stood. Well, I reckon he was perhaps the orneriest looking beast you ever see. One ear was sot back on his neck, and his tail was stove up, and his eye whiskers was singed off, and he was all blacked up with powder and smoke, and all sloppy with mud and slush from one end to the other. Well, sir, it warn't no use to try to apologize. We couldn't say a word. He took a sort of a disgusted look at himself, and then he looked at us, and it was just exactly the same as if he had said, "Gents, maybe you think it's smart to take advantage of a cat that ain't got no experience of quartz mining, but I think different." And then he turned on his heel and marched off home without ever saying another word. That was just his style, and maybe you won't believe it, but after that You never see a cat so prejudiced against quartz mining as what he was. And by, when he did get to going down in the shaft again, you'd have been astonished at his sagacity. The minute we'd detach off a blast and the fuse began to sizzle, he'd give a look as much as to say, "Well, I'll have to get you to excuse me," and it was surprising the way he'd shin out of that hole and go for a tree. Sagacity? It ain't no name for it. 'Twas inspiration. I said, "Well, Mr. Baker, his prejudice against quartz mining was remarkable, considering how he came by it. Couldn't you ever cure him of it?" "Cure him? No. When Tom Quartz was sot once, he was always sot, and you might have blowed him up as much as 3,000,000 times, and you'd never broken him of his cussed prejudice agin quartz mining." The affection and the pride that lit up Baker's face when he delivered this tribute to the firmness of his humble friend of other days will always be a vivid memory with me. At the end of 2 months we had never struck a pocket. We had panned up and down the hillsides till they looked plowed like a field. We could have put in a crop of grain then, but there would have been no way to get it to market. We got many good prospects, but when the gold gave out in the pan and we dug down, hoping and longing, we found only emptiness. The pocket that should have been there was as barren as our own. At last we shouldered our pans and shovels and struck out over the hills to try new localities. We prospected round Angel's Camp in Calaveras County during 3 weeks, but had no success. Then we wandered on foot among the mountains, sleeping under the trees at night, for the weather was mild, but still we remained as scentless as the last rose of summer. That is a poor joke, but it is in pathetic harmony with the circumstances, since we were so poor ourselves. In accordance with the custom of the country, our door had always stood open, and our board welcome to tramping miners. They drifted along nearly every day, dumped their post shovels by the threshold, and took pot luck with us. And now, on our own tramp, we never found cold hospitality. Our wanderings were wide and in many directions, and now I could give the reader a vivid description of the big trees and the marvels of the Yosemite. But what has this reader done to me that I should persecute him? I will deliver him into the hands of less conscientious tourists and take his blessing. Let me be charitable, though I fail in all virtues else. Note: some of the phrases in the above are mining technicalities purely, and may be a little obscure to the general reader. In placer diggings, the gold is scattered all through the surface dirt. In pocket diggings, it is concentrated in one little spot. In quartz, the gold is in a solid continuous vein of rock, enclosed between distinct walls of some other kind of stone. And this is the most laborious and expensive of all the different kinds of mining. Prospecting is hunting for a placer. Indications are signs of its presence. Panning out refers to the washing process by which the grains of gold are separated from the dirt. A prospect is what one finds in the first panful of dirt, and its value determines whether it is a good or a bad prospect, and whether it is worthwhile to tarry there or seek further. End of Part 6. Part 7 of Life in California, excerpted from Roughing It by Mark Twain. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 7, Chapter 78, Return to California after a trip to Hawaii. After half a year's luxurious vagrancy in the islands, I took shipping in a sailing vessel and regretfully returned to San Francisco, a voyage in every way delightful, but without an incident, unless lying 2 long weeks in a dead calm, 1,800 miles from the nearest land, may rank as an incident. Schools of whales grew so tame that day after day they played about the ship among the porpoises and the sharks without the least apparent fear of us, and we pelted them with empty bottles for lack of better sport. 24 hours afterward, these bottles would be still lying on the glassy water under our noses, showing that the ship had not moved out of her place in all that time. The calm was absolutely breathless, and the surface of the sea absolutely without a wrinkle. For a whole day and part of a night we lay so close to another ship that had drifted to our vicinity that we carried on conversations with her passengers, introduced each other by name, and became pretty intimately acquainted with people we had never heard of before and never heard of since. This was the only vessel we saw during the whole lonely voyage. We had 15 passengers, and to show how hard-pressed they were at last for occupation and amusement, I will mention that the gentlemen gave a good part of their time every day, during the calm, to try to sit on an empty champagne bottle lying on its side, and thread a needle without touching their heels to the deck, or falling over. And the ladies sat in the shade of the mainsail and watched the enterprise with absorbing interest. We were at sea 5 Sundays, and yet, but for the almanac, we never would have known but that all the other days were Sundays too. I was home again in San Francisco, without means and without employment. I tortured my brain for a saving scheme of some kind, and at last a public lecture occurred to me. I sat down and wrote one in a fever of hopeful anticipation. I showed it to several friends, but they all shook their heads. They said nobody would come to hear me, and I would make a humiliating failure of it. They said that as I had never spoken in public, I would break down in the delivery anyhow. I was disconsolate now, but at last an editor slapped me on the back and told me to go ahead. He said, "Take the largest house in town and charge $1 a ticket." The audacity of the proposition was charming. It seemed fraught with practical worldly wisdom, however. The proprietor of the several theaters endorsed the advice and said I might have his handsome new opera house at half price, $50. In sheer desperation I took it, on credit, for sufficient reasons. In 3 days I did $150 worth of printing and advertising, and was the most distressed and frightened creature on the Pacific coast. I could not sleep. Who could, under such circumstances? For other people there was facetiousness in the last line of my posters, but to me it was plaintive with a pang when I wrote it, "Doors open at 7:30. The trouble will begin at 8." That line has done good service since. Showmen have borrowed it frequently. I have even seen it appended to a newspaper advertisement, reminding school pupils in vacation what time next term would begin. As those 3 days of suspense dragged by, I grew more and more unhappy. I had sold 200 tickets among my personal friends, but I feared they might not come. My lecture, which had seemed humorous to me at first, grew steadily more and more dreary, till not a vestige of fun seemed left, and I grieved that I could not bring a coffin on the stage and turn the thing into a funeral. I was so panic-stricken at last that I went to 3 old friends, giants in stature, cordial by nature, and stormy-voiced, and said, "This thing is going to be a failure. The jokes in it are so dim that nobody will ever see them. I would like to have you sit in the parquet and help me through." They said they would. Then I went to the wife of a popular citizen and said that if she was willing to do me a very great kindness, I would be glad if she and her husband would sit prominently in the left-hand stage box, where the whole house could see them. I explained that I should need help, and would turn toward her and smile as a signal when I had been delivered of an obscure joke. And then, I added, don't wait to investigate, but respond. She promised. Down the street I met a man I never had seen before. He had been drinking and was beaming with smiles and good nature. He said, "My name's Sawyer. You don't know me, but that don't matter. I haven't got a cent, but if you knew how bad I wanted to laugh, you'd give me a ticket. Come now, what do you say?" "Is your laugh hung on a hair trigger?" That is it critical, or can you get it off easy?" My drawling infirmity of speech so affected him that he laughed a specimen or two that struck me as being about the article I wanted, and I gave him a ticket and appointed him to sit in the second circle, in the center, and be responsible for that division of the house. I gave him minute instructions about how to detect indistinct jokes, and then went away and left him chuckling placidly over the novelty of the idea. I ate nothing on the last of the 3 eventful days. I only suffered. I had advertised that on this 3rd day the box office would be open for the sake of reserved seats. I crept down to the theater at 4 in the afternoon to see if any sales had been made. The ticket seller was gone, the box office was locked up. I had to swallow suddenly, or my heart would have got out. "No sales," I said to myself. "I might have known it." I thought of suicide, pretended illness, flight. I thought of these things in earnest, for I was very miserable and scared. But of course I had to drive them away and prepare to meet my fate. I could not wait for 7:30. I wanted to face the horror and end it, the feeling of many a man doomed to hang, no doubt. I went down back streets at 6 o'clock and entered the theater by the back door. I stumbled my way in the dark among the ranks of canvas scenery and stood on the stage. The house was gloomy and silent, and its emptiness depressing. I went into the dark among the scenes again, and for an hour and a half gave myself up to the horrors, wholly unconscious of everything else. Then I heard a murmur. It rose higher and higher, and ended in a crash mingled with cheers. It made my hair rise. It was so close to me and so loud. There was a pause, and then another. Presently came a third, and before I well knew what I was about, I was in the middle of the stage, staring at a sea of faces, bewildered by the fierce glare of the lights, and quaking in every limb with a terror that seemed like to take my life away. The house was full, aisles and all. The tumult in my heart and brain and legs continued a full minute before I could gain any command over myself. Then I recognized the charity and the friendliness in the faces before me, and little by little my fright melted away, and I began to talk. Within 3 or 4 minutes I was comfortable, and even content. My 3 chief allies, with 3 auxiliaries, were on hand in the parquet, all sitting together, all armed with bludgeons, and all ready to make an onslaught upon the feeblest joke that might show its head. And whenever a joke did fall, their bludgeons came down and their faces seemed to split from ear to ear. Sawyer, whose hearty countenance was seen looming redly in the center of the second circle, took it up, and the house was carried handsomely. Inferior jokes never fared so royally before. Presently I delivered a bit of serious matter with impressive unction. It was my pet. And the audience listened with an absorbed hush that gratified me more than any applause. And as I dropped the last word of the clause, I happened to turn and catch Mrs. Blank's intent and waiting eye. My conversation with her flashed upon me, and in spite of all I could do, I smiled. She took it for the signal and promptly delivered a mellow laugh that touched off the whole audience, and the explosion that followed was the triumph of the evening. I thought that honest man Sawyer would choke himself, and as for the bludgeons, they performed like pile-drivers. But my poor little morsel of pathos was ruined. It was taken in good faith as an intentional joke, and the prize won of the entertainment, and I wisely let it go at that. All the papers were kind in the morning. My appetite returned. I had an abundance of money. All's well that ends well. End of Part 7. End of Life in California, excerpted from Roughing It by Mark Twain.